Sleet found every gap in Eleanor Ericsson's clothing and sat there like ice. It slid down the back of her neck. It stung her ears. It soaked the hem of her brown wool dress until the fabric clung to her calves with each step beside the hired cart. The wheels jolted over ruts and loose stone. Every jolt sent another small avalanche of damp folios shifting under the tarpaulin, and she put her shoulder to the load again, thin gloves darkened through, fingers burning and numb by turns. One boot had split at the sole 2 streets earlier. London water seeped in with each pace and made a soft, sucking sound against her stocking. Men in good coats passed with umbrellas and glanced once, then away, as if looking at labour too long might soil them. A lady in dove silk paused beneath the bookseller's awning and said, not quietly, that Harrow House had begun hiring plain girls by the cartload. Her companion laughed. Eleanor kept her eyes on the wheel rim, watched it cut a black track through slush, and said nothing. Her stomach had folded inward on itself since last night, when the kitchen sent up no tray, and the crust she had hidden in her apron pocket had turned green at one edge. Hunger sharpened smell until every baker's chimney became a kind of cruelty. She could catch yeast, warm milk, sugared peel. She could not have any of it. The carter, an old man with red knuckles and a cough that rattled, spat into the gutter and muttered that the annex books should never have been sent out in weather like this. She answered with a nod, because if she spoke, her teeth would chatter hard enough to shame her. The Duke of Harrow's circulating annex had lost a shutter in the night storm, and rain had slanted across 3 shelves before dawn. Those shelves had been hers to save. She had worked there since first light, lifting swollen quartos one by one and pressing blotting cloth between warped leaves, counting under her breath to keep panic from climbing into her throat. Parchment took water differently from rag paper. Calf bindings stiffened, then split at the hinges if forced. Ink bled in slow ghosts. She knew each injury by sight now. She knew which spines needed warmth and which needed air, which pages should be separated with bone folders, which should be left untouched for a day. She had learned with no instruction and no title, and no permission to claim knowledge. In Harrow House she was called useful when she carried crates, invisible when she mended, and presumptuous if she stood too near the great desk in the main library. A year of that had narrowed her world to weight and cold and smoke, up and down the back stairs, across stone passages where draughts lived, into rooms where hearths were lit for books while servants' beds froze. At night she slept in a sloped attic beneath cracked plaster and beams that sweated in rain. Wind whistled through the eaves. Her blanket smelled of dust and old candle wax. Her knees ached from kneeling on floorboards to patch torn end papers with paste thinned beyond usefulness. Her wrists remained red from lye and glue. Sometimes she woke with her jaw clenched from dreams in which every shelf in the Duke's collection had collapsed and buried her under paper no one would think to move. In the morning she would rise, wash in water that filmed with ice at the basin's edge, and go down again with her face arranged into quiet. Quiet was the first law Lady Norwood had beaten into her without ever raising her own voice. The lady preferred correction in drawing rooms, where witnesses made obedience permanent. Eleanor had been 19 when her father died in fever, still translating by candle until the day he could no longer hold a pen. He had been a Swedish scholar with a careful hand and a laugh that startled birds from garden hedges. He had once dined with men who now passed Eleanor in the street without recognition. Debt moved faster than mourning. Creditors came within a week, then came again with harder faces. Her mother, frightened and already coughing blood she hid in handkerchiefs, married for rank and protection, and died before either could hold. Lady Norwood inherited the house keys, the account books, and Eleanor with the same expression she used for cracked porcelain. First went the better gowns, then the music tutor, then the chest of books her father had left with their margins full of neat translation notes and occasional foolish jokes in Swedish. Lady Norwood sold that chest in one afternoon and told Eleanor learning was a decorative vice that poor women could not afford. What remained was work and reduction. Speak when spoken to, eat after others, accept gratitude never given. When she sent Eleanor to Harrow House, she wrote a letter with wax stamped in bright green that described her stepdaughter as docile, sturdy, and entirely illiterate, fit for dusting and haulage, unsuited to clerical trust. The lie travelled faster than Eleanor could. It arrived first. It shaped every eye that measured her afterward. So she made herself smaller where they could see and exact where they could not. In the Duke's neglected archive, she found a language no one had asked her to have. Misdated pamphlets, reversed shelf marks, a sermon catalogued under law, a map volume indexed to the wrong county, Latin tags copied with one fatal letter wrong, so that scholars had been chasing the same error for years. She corrected what she could at night on scraps she cut from wrapping paper and old invoices, writing in a hand so small the loops nearly vanished. She tucked each slip where the next reader would find it only if he opened the book with care. Cross-reference to Harrow MS 48. Date should read 1691, not 1681. Compare translation in Erickson folio copy, now missing. Not every correction was kind. Some were a kind of witness. Margin damp from long storage. Binding repaired with kitchen twine by untrained hand. She did not sign her name. She could not risk vanity. Lady Norwood had written twice in 12 months to remind the house steward that Eleanor remained her legal dependent and could be withdrawn at any time for matrimonial arrangements with a creditor's widowed brother in Kent. The first letter had called it prudence. The second had called it necessity. Eleanor had held both over the kitchen fire until the wax softened, then flattened them and tucked them beneath her mattress, as if pressure could erase words. By the second week of February, she had begun hiding a second set of slips behind loose stone near the attic chimney, and not for catalogues, but for herself. Copied lines from poems she remembered, a Greek declension chart, one paragraph of her father's final translation, rescued from memory and written at 3 a.m. with a nib too blunt for beauty. Literacy was the one room no one had managed to lock. She entered it in secret and left carrying enough dignity to survive another day. The cart lurched at the corner of Chancery Lane and nearly tipped a trunk of duplicate volumes into the gutter. Eleanor caught the side rope with both hands. Fibres burned across her palms through wet wool. The carter swore and hauled the mare back into line. A clerk from the auction rooms came running under an awning to shout that Harrow consignments should come to the rear door, not the front, where buyers stood with clean gloves and bored expressions. She inclined her head and steered the wheel where he pointed. No one asked whether she was cold. No one offered a cup of tea from the brazier smoking beside the entrance. The doorman took inventory from the carter and never looked at her face. She lifted folios down one stack at a time and carried them through a corridor that smelled of wet leather, coal ash, and men's pomade. Water dripped from her sleeve onto polished boards. She wiped each mark with her apron hem before anyone could scold. In the receiving room she knelt to untie twine and spread the least damaged books near the stove. Her fingertips were cracked open at the joints now. Glue from dawn repairs had turned white where it dried in the cuts. Each movement pinched. She kept moving. Useful hands only, the house understood. Hands that could be borrowed, dismissed, or traded with linen accounts. She bent over a worm-eaten atlas and felt the old fierce anger rise like heat behind her ribs. The anger that had no safe address. She pressed it into work. She checked the collation. She marked 2 missing plates on a slip the size of her thumb. She tucked it inside the front board and smoothed the edge flat. When she straightened, dizzy for one brief second, she saw her reflection in a darkened window pane. Pale face. Wet hair escaped from pins and curling against her temples. Eyes too large from hunger. The kind of face people called plain because it was tired and because no one had trained themselves to look twice. She looked twice herself, then looked away. In the corridor beyond, voices rose and fell in that bright public cadence of commerce, names and prices, and judgments traded as briskly as coins. Eleanor lifted the final trunk lid and found the little packet she had hidden beneath a stack of pamphlets. 6 blank scraps, folded dry within oilcloth, and a pencil stub shaved with a kitchen knife. Relief moved through her so quickly it almost hurt. She slipped the packet into the inside seam of her sleeve. The day would run until dark. Then she would return to Harrow House, carry the remaining wet volumes upstairs, warm paste by the servant's hearth, and mend until her candle drowned in its own wax. She would climb to the attic after midnight, peel off stockings stiff with sleet, and write by moonlight if the clouds broke. The city roared outside these walls, indifferent and grand. Inside she set another ruined book upon the table and opened it with reverence as if someone had once opened her life with the same care, and she might still learn how to do it for herself again. A loose flyleaf slid against her thumb as she opened the ruined book, and the page beneath it held a bookplate half lifted by damp, its ink thinned to grey at the edges but still legible where the crest sat. An elk above a shield, and below it, in her father's narrow hand, J. Erickson, Bishopsgate, 1816. The receiving room did not move, yet the floor seemed to tilt under her boots. Coal snapped in the stove. Men argued over lot numbers in the corridor. A porter laughed at something coarse and ordinary. She heard all of it as if through water because that crest had once been pressed into the inside of 600 volumes, and never by accident, each plate glued straight, each margin dusted first, her father refusing to mar paper by haste, even when his fingers shook in winter. He had lifted her to reach the upper shelves when she was 9 and solemn with duty, and he had said that books were like houses for the dead. One could visit them properly if one came with clean hands and humility. She could still feel the dry warmth of his sleeve against her cheek from that afternoon, smell lamp oil and cedar, hear the scratch of his pen moving between Swedish and English as if the 2 tongues had agreed to share one breath. Fever had taken him in July heat. Absurdly bright weather, windows open, bees in the garden. He had kept translating from his bed with a blanket over his knees, while sweat ran from his temples into his collar. On the final evening he asked for Harrow's charter abstracts, said he owed the Duke 3 corrected citations, and when she told him to sleep, he smiled at her as if she had spoken a foreign word with perfect accent. "If I stop," he whispered, "errors harden." By dawn, he could not lift his hand. By noon, the physician had begun avoiding her eyes. She stood now in wet wool, with that same hand's faded mark under her fingers, and the old helpless rage came back not as fire but as weight, the same weight she had carried in trunks and silence for a year. Debt moved into the house before morning had finished. Men with ledgers stood beneath the stair and tapped the silver with fingernails. One measured curtains while the coffin was still in the parlour. Her mother walked room to room with rouge she had not blended at her throat and said they would manage. They must manage. While coughing into linen, she folded out of sight. By Michaelmas of that year she had remarried into rank, 30 years older and brittle with gout, because protection had become another word for roof. The wedding breakfast tasted of cloves and dread. Eleanor remembered the look her mother gave her over the rim of a porcelain cup. Apology and command at once. Endure this and live. The rank saved them for exactly 1 season. Then winter pneumonia took her mother in a bed too grand for comfort, and Lady Norwood, Eleanor's stepmother, took the keys from the household steward with a smile that never reached her eyes, lavender perfume stinging the nose. Lady Norwood never shouted. She didn't need to. She could reduce a person with inventory, and she began with Eleanor the day after the mourning ribbons came down. "You will address me as Lady Norwood in company," she said in the blue drawing-room while visitors pretended not to listen. "You will eat after the girls. You will not touch the locked cabinet. Your late father indulged you in scholarly habits. We will have no such disorder now." The girls were her daughters by first marriage, Arabella and Cressida, older by 2 years and polished like silver that had never seen use. They took rooms that had once been Eleanor's schoolroom and music room, then took the walnut escritoire her father had promised her when she came of age, then took the ivory-backed brushes still threaded with her mother's dark hair, and did each theft with laughter soft enough to sound like manners. "Plain girls do not need mirrors," Arabella said, holding one of Eleanor's combs to the light. "Plain girls need aprons," Cressida answered, and Lady Norwood looked on as if she had heard sensible bookkeeping. They were not cruel in spectacular ways. They were relentless in small ones. The breakfast tray that failed to appear. The seamstress dismissed so dresses could not be altered, and old hems would show. The invitation copied incorrectly, so Eleanor arrived at church after services and stood in the cold while the carriage drove away without her. Once, in front of 4 guests and the vicar's wife, Lady Norwood struck her across the mouth for speaking when no question had been asked. The ring left a split at Eleanor's lower lip. Lady Norwood passed her a handkerchief and said, "Do not stain the carpet." Hunger became method. Labour became punishment staged as moral correction. She scrubbed nursery grates until her shoulders trembled, carried coal scuttles up 3 flights while Arabella practised Italian songs below, and slept in a former box-room where rain found the plaster seam above the bed. The girls wore her mother's pearls to assemblies, and said they had always suited them better. They read aloud from novels in voices of exaggerated innocence, while she stood at the door with mending in her lap, then asked her to explain words they knew she could define, and laughed when she remained silent. Lady Norwood forbade her from entering the study after dusk, then sold the study itself, shelf by shelf, to settle notes she had signed in her dead husband's name. Eleanor watched strangers carry away atlases she had dusted as a child and did not cry until the house was asleep. Even then she wiped her face at once because tears were taxed in that household. If they were seen, they were called theatrics. What Lady Norwood could not sell she repurposed into leverage. By spring she had a list of creditors willing to forgive portions of debt in exchange for marriage to a quiet dependent with no dowry and no advocate. Eleanor's name stood on that list like an item of furniture, movable upon agreement. The day Harrow House took her in began with green sealing wax and rain. Lady Norwood dictated the letter in the breakfast-room, while Eleanor stood by the mantel, with hands clasped hard enough to ache. The wording had been composed beforehand. Docile, sturdy, entirely illiterate, fit for dusting and haulage, unsuitable for clerical trust. Lady Norwood paused over each phrase as if selecting jewels, then sanded the ink and folded the sheet with deliberate care. "You will not dispute this," she said, holding the letter just above the flame until the wax softened. "A woman who reads develops opinions. Opinions in your station are expensive." Eleanor answered, "Yes, Lady Norwood," because refusal would have sent her directly to Kent, to the widower with 3 sons and debts of his own, and because survival sometimes demanded a bowed head while the mind stayed upright. At Harrow she found exactly what the letter had prepared for her. Scepticism, orders, no questions. The steward assigned her to lifting and repair. The footman called her attic the rook's nest. The laundress advised her not to speak unless addressed, not from malice but from seasoned caution. Yet work made one corridor she could walk without permission. In misfiled shelves and rotting paste she found problems that yielded to attention. In that attention she found breath. The hidden slips began as necessity and became record, each tiny correction a refusal to vanish. She used discarded invoice margins, trimmed square with a penknife. She wrote at night with nibs worn flat, saving better points for labels that might be seen by scholars. She tucked notes where only a careful hand would find them, and when one returned missing, she knew someone had read and used it, though no one said her name. There had been mornings when she taught Thomas in the map room before sunrise, the boy's hair uncombed, his shame raw as her cracked knuckles. He traced letters that swam on the page and breathed too fast when he failed. She taught him to mark vowels in blue and consonants in graphite, to break words into stones he could step across, to stop apologizing for a mind that moved differently from his tutor's expectations. "Again," she would say when he wanted to quit. "Slower." He would glare, then try once more, and when he succeeded he looked startled as if success had happened to someone else. She asked nothing for it. She hid the lesson cards after each dawn under a loose map drawer, not from guilt, but from prudence, because useful hands were tolerated and useful minds were negotiated over. In the receiving room, with sleet drying stiff on her hem and her father's crest damp beneath her palm, she eased the loosened bookplate flat, slipped a square of blotting paper over it, and pressed it gently with the heel of her hand until it held. Then she tore one blank scrap from the packet in her sleeve, wrote in minute script, "Plate belongs to Ericsson Private Library, displaced after 1820 estate sale," and slid the note where the next honest reader might find it. The act steadied her breathing. Outside the door bids rose and fell like distant surf against stone. Inside she set the book aside to dry and reached for the next damaged volume, carrying all that had been taken from her, as if it were weight she had trained herself to lift without dropping. The next volume was heavier, calfskin swollen and cold, and Eleanor had just shifted it to the edge of the table when the receiving room door struck the wall hard enough to rattle the stove grate. A clerk stumbled backward into the room first, one hand up in apology, his neat hair damp and flattened, his expression split between deference and alarm. Behind him came the rustle of expensive silk and the sharp, clean sting of lavender water that reached Eleanor before the woman herself crossed the threshold. Lady Norwood entered as if she were stepping into her own drawing-room. Gloved fingers closed around a silver-topped cane she did not need, bonnet veil pinned back to show the full severity of her face. Arabella followed at her shoulder in plum velvet, lips curved in that familiar little smile that made cruelty look like breeding. Cressida stayed in the doorway, fanning herself, though the corridor was cold, her gaze finding Eleanor at once and fastening there with open satisfaction. Men in the passage slowed and then stopped altogether, auction assistants and buyers and porters forming an uneven ring of witnesses at the door. Eleanor felt the room contract around her, the air thinning, her wet sleeves suddenly heavy against her skin. Lady Norwood did not greet her. She looked over the table, over the blotting paper and twine and damaged spines, and spoke to the clerk as if naming an inventory discrepancy. "That trunk is mine, the one marked Harrow Duplicate Lot 3. It contains property removed from my late husband's house by this girl under false pretences." The clerk's eyes flickered toward Eleanor and away again. "My lady, these items were entered under the Duke's seal this morning." Lady Norwood took one step forward, cane tip clicking on board, and seized Eleanor's wrist before she could move back. The grip was precise, practiced, the pressure just above the pulse where pain travelled fastest. "Do not look at her," she said to the room. "She can mimic humility. It has always been her talent." Her perfume sat in Eleanor's throat like smoke. Eleanor tried to free her hand without struggle, because struggle would be called insolence, and insolence would be used as proof. Arabella drifted nearer the table and lifted one of the damp folios with gloved fingertips, as if touching refuse. "She used to copy father's signatures for amusement," she said lightly to no one and everyone. "I warned you she would steal papers next." Cressida laughed from the doorway. "She cannot read a prayer book, but she can carry half a library. Remarkable priorities." The circle at the door tightened. Someone murmured that Harrow's staff were always peculiar. Someone else asked under his breath whether the plain one was mad. Eleanor's fingers had gone numb under Lady Norwood's hand, yet her shoulder still remembered the last public correction, the ring against bone, the command not to stain the carpet. She drew one slow breath and said, "My lady, you have no claim to these consignments." Lady Norwood's expression brightened, the way it did when prey moved exactly as expected. "Hear her," she said softly. "A servant instructs me on claims." She yanked Eleanor one pace forward so the table edge struck her thigh. Pain shot up and steadied her at once. The old fear came with it, cold and exact. This would be done quickly, publicly, and with language that made theft of a life sound lawful. Lady Norwood lifted her voice for the corridor. "This woman is my dependent. She was placed at Harrow House for menial duty only. She is illiterate. She has been concealing and removing saleable materials while pretending usefulness. I dismiss her now. She returns with me." The words landed in the room like stamped seals. A porter shifted his weight as if to help, and then thought better of it. The clerk opened his ledger and closed it again. Eleanor felt each watching eye as a physical thing. Safe space, if she had ever believed in it, vanished in one breath. She had been careful here, small, useful, unseen. Lady Norwood had crossed London in weather fit to drown horses, because somebody had told her Eleanor was near marketable books and unguarded doors. Of course she had. Control was her only religion and public humiliation, her liturgy. Eleanor looked at the trunk in question, at the rope knots she had tied herself, and thought of the blank scraps in her sleeve, the hidden notes in Harrow shelves, Thomas tracing vowels at dawn with a bitten pencil, her father's crest softening under damp. If Lady Norwood took her now, there would be no return to those rooms, no attic, no map drawer, no library at all. Kent would follow. A creditor's widowed brother with practical hands and no patience for books would follow. The future narrowed to a corridor she could already smell. Sour ale, ledgers, obligation without end. Her pulse beat against Lady Norwood's fingers. "Release me," she said, low and clear, because pleading would feed the woman and silence would condemn her. Arabella clicked her tongue. "Such tone, Eleanor. You forget yourself in company." Lady Norwood's mouth thinned. No, she remembers exactly who she is. That is the disease. She tightened her grip and turned toward the door, intending to drag, not guide. Eleanor planted her split boot against the board and did not move. Pain tore along her wet soul. The room stirred with that charged, ugly anticipation crowds, reserved for punishments they could pretend were administrative. Lady Norwood lifted the cane as if to strike her hand free. At that instant, another voice cut across the doorway, low enough that no one needed to shout, hard enough that every person there obeyed before understanding they had done so. "Release her!" The crowd opened, because men who lived by rank knew that voice before they saw the speaker. Lord Alistair Vane, Duke of Harrow, stepped from the side aisle where catalogue lots were stored, his greatcoat dark with sleet at the shoulders, black hair damp at the temples, gloves in one hand, hat in the other. He was taller than memory had made him from distant corridors. Broad through chest and back, movement spare, controlled. A pale scar crossed the line of his jaw and vanished under his collar when he turned. His eyes, fixed now on Lady Norwood's hand around Eleanor's wrist, held the flat winter colour of a river before snow. He did not bow. He did not offer greeting. He came 3 measured steps into the receiving room and set his hat on the nearest crate, as if this were now his chamber, and all others had become petitioners. "Stand back," he said. "You will speak one at a time." Lady Norwood released Eleanor at once. The marks of her fingers flared white, then red on Eleanor's skin. Blood rushed back in painful pins. Arabella dropped the folio she had been holding. It struck the table edge and nearly slid. Eleanor caught it on reflex and set it flat, hands shaking only after it was safe. The Duke's gaze flicked to that movement and returned to Lady Norwood. "State your claim." Lady Norwood recovered quickly, smoothing her glove cuffs with small, efficient motions. "Your Grace, this is an unfortunate misunderstanding. My stepdaughter has a history of dramatics and falsehood. I found her here in possession of books from my late husband's estate, books she has no right to handle, much less annotate." The last word sharpened. "She cannot read. She has been deceiving your staff." Cressida added from the doorway, "She learned to imitate letters as children imitate birdsong." A few men laughed, uncertain and brief. The Duke did not look toward them. He moved to the table instead, selected a random folio from the stack nearest Eleanor, and opened it midway with the care of long practice. Damp pages breathed cold against his knuckles. A slip, no larger than 2 fingers, loosened from the gutter and fell against the paper. He picked it up. Eleanor saw her own minute hand on the scrap and felt heat flood her face despite the cold. Shelf correction, date emendation, cross-reference to a charter abstract her father had once cited. The Duke read it once, then turned the slip so the room could see without touching. "This hand rebuilt my catalogue for 12 months, he said. "She read what my scholars missed." Silence took the corridor. Even the stove seemed to stop cracking. Lady Norwood stared at the slip as if it were a trick card. "Your Grace, servants copy marks from habit. It proves nothing." He opened the folio's front board and traced a line of corrected Latin with one gloved finger, then lifted his gaze to her face. "The ablative was wrong in my published index for 9 years. Corrected here, in the same hand." He drew a second volume from beneath the first and opened to a penciled tab. Another slip, another hand. Eleanor's hand. "Dates reconciled against parish records that are locked in my West Archive, accessed lawfully only by staff under my seal." His voice remained level, which made each word strike harder. "Do not call this mimicry in my house papers." Lady Norwood's composure thinned at the edges. "Then your house has been compromised, Your Grace, by a dependent woman with no breeding and no authority. I act to protect all parties. You act, he said, to remove a witness. The sentence dropped between them like stone. He turned then, finally, to Eleanor. It was the first time he had looked at her without passing through her to a shelf behind. She felt the weight of it physically, like stepping from shadow into winter sun. His gaze moved once, fast and exact. Wet hem, split boot, cracked knuckles, wrist already bruising under her skin tone, the tremor she could not still in her left hand. He named none of it yet. Miss Erickson, he said. Her name in his voice sounded unfamiliar, formal, and stripped clean. Why was your education concealed? The room leaned in. Arabella's fan stopped mid-stroke. Eleanor could feel Lady Norwood willing her to stammer, to deny, to choose fear and sink. She had lived a year in rooms where speaking truth had cost food, sleep, safety. She understood cost. She also understood that this was the first direct question any master in Harrow's service had ever asked her about herself. The answer rose before caution could swallow it. Because a literate poor woman is easier to sell than to hire? No one moved. Cressida made a small sound that might have been disbelief. Lady Norwood hissed, "Insolent child!" The Duke's expression did not alter, but something in his posture changed, a stillness that was not indifference. He took one half step so that he stood between Eleanor and Lady Norwood without flourish, as if rearranging furniture for practical use. "You will not address her again until I permit it," he said. Lady Norwood drew herself up. "Your Grace, you exceed propriety. She is under my legal control. That question is now disputed." He gestured to the clerk at the door, who startled and nearly dropped his ledger. "Send for Mr. Fenwick from my solicitor's chambers immediately, and dispatch a note to Harrow House. No documents concerning Miss Erickson are to leave the estate without my written order." The clerk ran. Minutes later the sleet had thickened into hard rain against the front panes, and still no one in that room seemed willing to breathe too loudly. The Duke set the slips together on the table, aligning their edges with military precision, then covered them with a blotter to shield the ink from damp. "These are evidence," he said, not to Eleanor, not to Lady Norwood, but to the room itself. "They will be inventoried under my seal." He looked back at Eleanor once more. "Can you stand?" The question should have been simple. It landed like mercy and command at once. "Yes, Your Grace." Her knees were shaking. She straightened anyway. "Good. You will remain here." Then, to a footman who had appeared in the corridor at last, pale and rigid with nerves, "Tea, dry cloths, a chair near the stove." He returned his attention to Lady Norwood. "You will wait in the outer office until my solicitor arrives. If you attempt to leave with any person or paper, you will be stopped." Lady Norwood's cheeks mottled under powder. "You humiliate me before traders." "No," he said, "your conduct does that." Arabella touched her mother's sleeve, whispering urgently. Cressida had gone white. They withdrew by inches, silk whispering like rain through reeds, until the clerk guided them out and shut the door. Only then did Eleanor realise she was gripping the table so hard her fingertips had gone bloodless. She loosened them one by one. The Duke did not leave. He remained at the opposite side of the table, broad shoulders blocking the draught from the corridor, rainwater darkening the boards under his boots. Around them the auction room resumed in fragments. Distant calls of lot numbers, a cartwheel in the yard, a bell from some church she could not see. Inside this smaller room the air held the scent of wet wool, coal, lavender, fading to nothing. He looked down at the bruises rising on her wrist and spoke without preamble. "Who else knows you can read?" Eleanor kept her hand on the table edge and answered him without lowering her gaze. No one in this room believed it until this morning. In Harrow House, only your nephew knows enough to guess." His eyes sharpened. "Thomas knows." "He knows that I can sound out words with him. He does not know what that means in law." She swallowed, throat dry from coal smoke and fear. "I did not tell him to keep a secret. I told him only that some lessons belong to quiet rooms." The Duke studied her face, as if weighing the shape of each word. Rain beat harder against the front panes. Somewhere in the corridor a porter dragged a crate, and the wood shrieked against stone. He asked, "Where did you teach him?" "The old map room, at dawn, when the house was still." "For how long?" "Since Michaelmas." He did not speak for a moment. She could see the faint pull of the scar along his jaw when he set his teeth. Then he said, "Who authorized that?" "No one." Shame burned her neck, then passed. "He came to the library one morning with a torn page in his hand and would not meet my eyes. I could not leave him so." The Duke's expression did not soften, but the silence changed. Less interrogation, more calculation. He lifted one of the slips from beneath the blotter, read 2 lines, then set it down with care. "You ignored rank, procedure, and direct household boundaries." "Yes, Your Grace." "And still you continued." "I continued, Your Grace." His mouth moved once, not quite a smile. "Good." A knock sounded at the receiving room door, urgent and uneven. The clerk pushed in halfway, breathing hard. "Your Grace, Mr. Fenwick has been sent for. He is on his way. Lady Norwood requests immediate departure on grounds of insult. She states she will not remain among traders." "She will remain," the Duke said. "Seat her in the outer office. Separate her from her daughters. No papers, no private conversations, no carriage called without my order." The clerk nodded and vanished. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Her wrist throbbed where Lady Norwood had gripped her. The bruise was deepening, finger marks dark under pale skin. The Duke noticed it again. She saw the shift in his focus as plainly as if he had touched the mark. He crossed to the sideboard where a wash basin sat and poured clean water from a jug into a shallow bowl. He spoke without looking at her. "Sit." She hesitated. His head turned. That was not optional. She sat in the chair the footman had brought. Heat from the stove reached her knees in weak waves. She had not realized how badly she was shaking until she tried to keep still. He dipped a clean cloth, wrung it once, and held it out. "Press this to the wrist. Do not wrap it tight." She took the cloth. Their gloved and ungloved fingers touched for one instant. Her skin prickled despite the cold. "Thank you, Your Grace." He gave a short nod and moved away, creating distance at once, as if the brief nearness had been purely practical. It had been. She told herself that, and pressed the cloth over the bruises until the ache dulled. Voices rose in the corridor again. One was Lady Norwood's, clipped and furious behind restraint. Another, thinner, pitched with distress, cut through the noise and stopped Eleanor's breath mid-chest. "Thomas." She set the cloth down and half rose before thinking. The Duke moved faster, one hand out in warning. "Stay here," the boy's voice came again, closer now, ragged with panic. "I said I must see him. Let go. Let go." Eleanor stood fully. "Your Grace, he is frightened." "I heard him. The separation order has been given, but they have not finished moving them yet." A second voice, Arabella's, floated after the child in a tone sweet enough to wound. Poor little lordling, always in tears over a page. The Duke's face went hard as iron. He stepped to the door and pulled it open. Thomas stood in the corridor with his cap in one fist, hair wet and flattened against his forehead, cheeks blotched red from cold and humiliation. A groom held his shoulder, uncertain whether to restrain or comfort. Behind them, Cressida watched with bright interest while Lady Norwood sat rigid in the outer office chair, cane across her lap, gaze already moving between the boy and Eleanor, as if she had found a fresh point of attack. Thomas saw the Duke and tried to pull himself upright. "Uncle, I am sorry. I came because Mr. Pike said there was trouble, and they would not let me in, and she—" His eyes slid to Eleanor and fixed there with naked relief. "Miss Erikson," the Duke asked, "why are you here in this weather?" Thomas thrust out a folded paper, corners crushed from his grip. "You told me to bring the charter copy if I could read the heading first. I could not read it. I thought if I came quickly—" His mouth twisted. "Lady Norwood said I am too stupid to carry legal papers." Lady Norwood lifted one shoulder. "I stated a fact, Your Grace. The child struggles. We all know it." Thomas flinched as if struck. Eleanor stepped into the corridor before she remembered the order to stay. She knelt to the boy's height, wet skirts pooling on the boards, and held out her hand for the crumpled paper. "May I?" He gave it to her at once. His fingers were icy. She warmed them between both of her hands for 2 breaths, 3 until his trembling eased. "You are cold," she said softly. "Look at me." He looked. "Good. We do this as always. 1 line. Slow." Lady Norwood made a sharp sound of disdain. "How touching. The drudge performs a schoolroom." Eleanor did not turn her head. "Please bring him nearer the stove," she said to the groom. The groom looked to the Duke. At the Duke's single nod, he guided Thomas inside. Eleanor followed with the paper, still kneeling when the boy sank into the chair by the heat. She smoothed the sheet against her thigh. It was the Charter Abstract, copied in a cramped clerk's hand, with Latin headings that had defeated grown men in Harrow's own library. Thomas stared at it as if it were a sentence pronounced over him. Eleanor reached into her sleeve seam and drew out the pencil stub she always carried. "You remember the marks?" she said. He nodded once. "Show me." His hand shook as he took the pencil. She steadied his wrist lightly. Together they marked vowels above the first hard word, small dots and strokes. The corridor noise faded to a far hum. She heard only the child's breathing, too quick at first, then slower as the pattern returned to him. "Now we break it," she said. "Do not wrestle the whole. Take the first stone." His lips moved. "Carta." Again. "Carta." "Good, next." "Antiqua." "Good, next." He faltered at the 3rd word and his eyes flooded with tears he hated. He pushed the paper away. "I cannot." Eleanor caught the edge before it fell. "You can. You are tired and cold. That is not the same thing." Across the room, Lady Norwood gave a brittle laugh. "He has his father's weakness. Sentiment in place of discipline." The Duke did not answer her. He stood in the doorway between receiving room and office, very still, watching. Eleanor leaned closer to Thomas and lowered her voice. "Listen to me. Failure is not a character. It is a moment. We cross moments. We do not live in them." His breath hitched. "She said everyone knows I am slow. Everyone knows weather changes and pages tore. Both are repaired." A wet laugh escaped him despite himself. He scrubbed his face with his sleeve and bent over the line again. "Antiqua." "Better." He finished the heading in a rough whisper. When he reached the final word and got it right, he looked up in startled triumph, exactly as he always did, as if success belonged to somebody else and had wandered into his hands by mistake. Eleanor nodded once. "There, you read it," Lady Norwood snapped. "Parlour tricks, it proves nothing." Thomas turned in his chair, small shoulders squared, though he was still shaking. "It proves I am not what you called me." Silence dropped like a curtain. Cressida looked away first. Arabella's painted composure cracked at the edges. The Duke stepped forward 1 pace. "Miss Ericsson," Eleanor rose carefully, knees stiff from cold boards. "Your Grace." "You disobeyed my order." "I did, Your Grace." "Why?" She glanced at Thomas, then back at the Duke. "Because a frightened boy should not be punished for letters moving on a page." The room held that sentence. Even the clerk at the far desk stopped shuffling documents. Mr. Fenwick arrived moments later, breath steaming from the dash through rain, grey greatcoat dripping at the hem, legal satchel clutched under one arm. He bowed to the Duke, then took in the arrangement of people with one quick professional sweep. Lady Norwood apart, daughters pale, child by the stove, Eleanor standing wet and bruised with a paper marked in teaching signs. "Your Grace," he said, "I came as quickly as roads permitted." "Good," the Duke replied. "You will take statements now. Begin with Miss Ericsson." Fenwick opened his ledger. "In private?" "No. Here." Lady Norwood straightened. "I object." "You may object in court," the Duke said. "Not here." Fenwick dipped his pen. "Miss Ericsson, state your full name and age." "Eleanor Ingrid Ericsson, 22. Current position in Harrow House." She paused. The old answer rose by habit. "Labourer, assistant, nobody." She forced it aside. "Assigned to library haulage and repair. Informally responsible for catalogue corrections." Fenwick's pen scratched faster. "Can you read and write? English and Latin?" "Yes." "Who instructed you?" "My father, Johann Ericsson, translator." Fenwick nodded. "Did Lady Norwood represent you as illiterate when placing you in service?" "She did." "Do you possess written proof?" "I possess her letters. 2. Both threaten removal from marriage settlement." Lady Norwood leaned forward, voice tight with controlled rage. "Those letters are private family correspondence. She stole them." "I received them addressed to house staff regarding my person," Eleanor said. "I kept them because I feared abduction." Fenwick did not look up. "Do you know where the letters are now?" "In my attic room at Harrow House, under the mattress ticking." The Duke said, "They will be retrieved under witness today." Fenwick turned a page. "One more matter. Did you provide reading instruction to Master Thomas Vane without formal appointment?" Eleanor felt Thomas go still beside the stove. This answer could be used as trespass into aristocratic nursery life, another charge in another voice. She could protect herself by saying the boy sought her, and she had no choice. She could protect him by taking blame cleanly and leaving his shame untouched. She chose. "Yes," she said, "I instructed him. For payment." "No." "For favour." "No." "Then why?" She did not glance at Thomas this time. She looked at Fenwick and spoke to the line he had asked for. "Because he asked for help and was refused elsewhere." Fenwick's eyes lifted briefly, unreadable, then dropped to the page again. "Did any member of this household order you to stop?" "No member knew." Lady Norwood gave a short, triumphant exhale, seizing on the point. "There, concealment, insubordination. She admits it." Eleanor turned toward her, spine straight despite exhaustion. "I concealed tutoring to protect him from mockery, not to injure your claim." Lady Norwood's cane struck the floor once. "You presume to accuse me." "I describe what was said in this corridor." The Duke's voice entered between them like a closed door. "Enough!" He looked to Fenwick. "Record that Lady Norwood mocked the child's capacity during active dispute," Fenwick wrote. Thomas slid from the chair and came to stand beside Eleanor, close enough that his sleeve brushed hers. He held the marked charter copy to his chest. "May I make a statement?" Fenwick hesitated, then glanced to the Duke. The Duke answered, "If he wishes." Thomas lifted his chin with visible effort. Miss Erikson never shamed me when I was wrong. She never called me dull. She said, slow is not broken. He swallowed hard. I learned more in her dawn lessons than in a year with hired masters. Fenwick recorded each line. Arabella stared at the floorboards. Cressida's fan had stopped moving. The rain eased at last to a fine hiss on the panes. An hour had passed since the Duke first asked who knew Eleanor could read, and the room smelled now of wet wool drying by heat, ink, and the bitter trace of extinguished pride. Fenwick sanded the final page and shook it dry. Your Grace, I will prepare immediate petition to freeze Lady Norwood's control over Miss Erikson's inheritance pending magistrate review. I will also request seizure of relevant correspondence and account ledgers. Do it, the Duke said. Lady Norwood rose in one controlled motion, silk rustling like a blade drawn from sheath. You side with a servant over family. The Duke met her gaze without warmth. I side with evidence. She turned to Eleanor then, and for one instant the polished mask dropped. Naked hatred showed, old and hungry. This is not finished. Eleanor felt the threat strike and pass through her like winter wind through broken glass. She answered with the steadiness she had built from years of hunger and hidden paper slips. It is finished where my silence ends. The Duke signalled to the footman at the door. Escort Mrs. Norwood and her daughters to separate carriages, 2 guards with each. They return to their townhouse and await summons. No calls, no letters sent. The footman bowed and obeyed. Lady Norwood did not resist, physically. She left with her head high, daughters in her wake, lavender scent thinning down the corridor until it was gone. Only then did Eleanor realise her knees were trembling again. She set one hand on the table to anchor herself. Thomas looked up at her, uncertain now that crisis had passed. She touched his shoulder lightly. You read well, she said. His eyes shone. Will you still teach me tomorrow? She opened her mouth and stopped. Tomorrow had become a legal word, a dangerous word, a door she did not yet know she could cross. The Duke answered for her, gaze still on Eleanor. Yes, she will. The words struck Eleanor harder than Lady Norwood's grip had. Thomas let out one shaking breath and leaned into her side for half a second, then remembered himself and stepped back, still clutching the marked charter. Mr. Fenwick closed his ledger, tied the tape around it, and asked 2 clipped questions about carriage routes and court hours. The Duke answered without looking away from Eleanor. Orders moved outward from him in clean lines. Guards to the townhouse, copies to chambers, seals on all outgoing correspondence. The room that had held humiliation an hour earlier now held procedure, and procedure, in his hands, felt like a wall. By the time the church bell across the lane struck 4, the rain had thinned to a grey mist. Thomas had been wrapped in a dry cloak and sent ahead under the groom's care, with strict instruction to remain in the schoolroom and speak to no visitors. Fenwick departed with the statements and the packet of slips, each one counted in front of witnesses and sealed with red wax. The clerk, who had once avoided Eleanor's face, now bowed to her before he left the threshold. It was awkward, hurried, and sincere enough to ache. When the outer office finally emptied, Eleanor reached for the stack of damp folios by habit. The Duke's hand closed over the top volume before she could lift it. Leave them. Your Grace, they will warp if they cool too quickly. They will survive one night. She kept hold of the leather board. The 12th century binding on this one will not. His eyes lowered to her fingers, raw and split, then rose again. And you? The question found the one weak seam she had not patched. She released the book. He turned to the footman waiting near the door. Wrap those in dry linen and send them by cart to Harrow, map room hearth. Mrs. Davies is to supervise the drying. No one else touches them." The footman bowed and moved at once. Eleanor said, "Mrs. Davies does not know the sequence." The Duke answered, "Then you will tell her when your hands stop shaking." She had not known they were visible. She pressed them together, but the tremor remained. He noticed the attempt and did not pretend not to notice it. "Sit." She obeyed this time. He stood where he was, not pacing, not filling the silence with reassurance he did not know how to give. His stillness was heavier than movement. In the corridor, boots passed, a crate thudded. Someone laughed too loudly in relief that the spectacle had ended. Inside the receiving room, nothing moved except steam from the tea the footman had set down and forgotten. At last he said, "I found your hand in my catalogue in November." She looked up sharply. He continued as if stating weather. "The correction in Petrarch Volume 3, then the Charter Index, then the misdated sermons. I set 2 errors myself and waited to see whether they would be mended." Shame and fury rose together. "You tested me." "Yes," her mouth tightened. "And if I had failed?" "You did not." "That is not an answer." For the first time since entering the room, he looked almost tired. The scar at his jaw pulled when he spoke. "If you had failed, I would have dismissed a theory and kept a labourer. You succeeded, and I understood my house had been lying to me." She heard the words and heard what sat under them. He had known for months. He had watched. He had done nothing until Lady Norwood arrived with her hand around Eleanor's wrist. The old bitterness came fast and clean. "You understood and left me in the attic." "Yes." "Left me carrying crates in sleet." "Yes." "Left me to be called illiterate in your own library." His answer came after a long breath. "Yes." No defence, no polished excuse. The plain admission cut deeper than denial would have. It also left her with nowhere easy to put her anger. She looked away to the stove, to black iron, to heat she could not yet feel. He said, low and exact, "I believed I was respecting boundaries set before my time. I was wrong." She closed her eyes for one beat. When she opened them, he was still watching her wrist where the bruise darkened. "You have fever," he said. "I am cold." "You have fever. It will pass. Perhaps you will still be seen by the physician tonight." "I cannot afford a physician." "You are not being asked to afford anything." She almost laughed at the absurdity of the sentence, but no sound came. "Your Grace, if this is pity—" "It is not." "Then what is it?" His expression did not soften. His voice did by a fraction. "It is correction." The carriage to Harrow waited under a dripping awning. He did not permit her to walk beside the cart. He put her inside first, handed her up without ceremony, then took the opposite seat. The coach rocked forward into wet London streets. Water chased itself down the glass in crooked lines. Eleanor held her hands in her lap to hide the shaking and failed to hide it. After 2 corners, the Duke shrugged off his greatcoat and held it out. "Put this on." "You will be cold." "I am already cold." She took it. The wool was heavy and rain-damp at the shoulders, warm at the lining from his body. She draped it over herself and hated that relief arrived instantly. For several minutes they rode in silence. Then he said, "When we reach Harrow, you will not go to the attic alone." "That is where my letters are." "I know, I will go with you." She turned to him fully. "Your Grace, servants will talk." "Let them." "It will damage me." "They have been damaging you for a year." The carriage jolted over stone. He did not blink. At Harrow House, lamps had already been lit against the wet dusk. The front hall smelled of beeswax and wet wool. 2 footmen stiffened at the sight of Eleanor stepping in under the Duke's coat, then stared harder when he said, Miss Erikson is under my direct protection. She is to have passage in all rooms of the library wing at any hour. Any interference comes to me." The words ran through the hall like a thrown knife. A maid carrying logs stopped outright. The steward appeared from the passage, face pale, and bowed too low. "Your Grace, shall I prepare the blue sitting-room for—" "No. Send Mrs. Davies to the map room. Hot broth, clean bandages, then bring the attic key-ring." The steward hesitated one fatal second. "The attic, Your Grace." The Duke's gaze fixed on him. "Now." They climbed the narrow back stair together, the one Eleanor had climbed alone for a year with aching knees and arms full of damaged books. Tonight the Duke took the turns without comment, shoulders barely clearing the wall where the ceiling sloped. At the top landing, damp draught met them like an uninvited hand. Eleanor unlocked her door with fingers that fumbled once. The room was as she had left it at dawn. Low ceiling, narrow bed, basin with a skim of cold, one chair with a cracked cane seat, the blanket folded tight to hide its threadbare edge. Her hidden life was here in plain sight, and yet still hidden unless one knew where to look. She crossed to the bed, lifted the ticking at the corner seam, and drew out the 2 letters from Lady Norwood, flattened thin with rereading. She held them out. He did not take them at once. His eyes had gone to the loose stone by the chimney. "You keep more there," he said. Her pulse kicked. "That is private." His gaze returned to her face. "Is it evidence?" "No." "Is it yours?" "Yes." "Then no one touches it without your permission." She stood very still, then knelt and eased the stone free. Behind it sat the narrow bundle of scraps tied with frayed thread, copied declensions, poem lines, shelf corrections not yet placed, and the paragraph of her father's final translation, written from memory. She held the bundle against her chest before she could stop herself. He saw the gesture. He looked away first. A knock came at the door. The steward, breathing from the climb, held out a leather dispatch case and sealing tape. The Duke took the case, set it on the chair, and opened it for her. "Place the letters inside." She did. "Anything else relevant to Lady Norwood's claim?" She thought of the threat notes, the marriage names, the dates. No documents, only memory. "Then speak memory to Fenwick tonight, and he will make it paper." He sealed the case in front of her, pressed his signet into wax, and handed it back to the steward with a command to deliver directly to Chambers. The steward nodded and fled down the stair. When they were alone again, Eleanor said quietly, "You should not be here." "I am aware." "Then why are you still here?" He looked around the room once, at the cracked plaster seam, at the bowl with ice at the edge, at the stack of mended shoes beneath her bed, at the candle stubs she had saved down to nothing. His voice came rougher than before. "Because I did not come sooner." The sentence settled in the low room and did not move. She had no prepared answer for remorse from a man who commanded half a county with 2 words. She had expected authority, perhaps generosity, perhaps a legal arrangement clean enough for court. Not this. A draft slid through the eaves and lifted the edge of one paper from her bundle. He noticed and stepped nearer, one measured pace, then stopped as if a line had been drawn across the boards. "You will not sleep here tonight," he said. "I have no other room." "You do now. The east schoolroom chamber is empty. Dry, warm, lock on the door. Mrs. Davies will move your things. That chamber is in the family corridor. It is in my house." She could hear her own heartbeat in the pause that followed. "People will say, they will say what they are told to say." "And what are they told?" His jaw set. "That you are indispensable to the library and answer to me alone." The words were dangerous. So was the steadiness in them. She said, almost against her will, "You make commands sound like chains." "And sometimes like shelter," he said. Downstairs a door closed hard. Somewhere farther off, Thomas called for Mrs. Davies and was answered. Life continued through stone and corridor and rank. In the attic, narrow as a coffin and just as cold, the Duke of Harrow stood without moving, as if leaving before she was safe had become physically difficult. She gathered her scraps and tucked them into the inner pocket of his coat still around her shoulders. Her fingers brushed the lining he had warmed. When she looked up, he was watching that small motion with a concentration that felt almost like pain. "Miss Erikson," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Do not thank me for this," she frowned. "For what, then?" "For finally seeing what was in front of me." He stepped back, opened the door and waited for her to precede him down the stair. She passed, and he fell in behind her, not close enough to touch, close enough to catch her if she slipped. At the turn of the landing he spoke once more, low enough that only she could hear. "From tonight, no one in Harrow House calls you illiterate again." The stair creaked under their weight, and each step down from the attic felt like crossing a border she had not been permitted to name. At the first landing, Mrs. Davies waited with a shawl and a lamp, her lined face grave, eyes bright with contained feeling. "Come, miss," the housekeeper said, not asking leave from anyone now. "Broth is ready. The physician is in the east chamber." The Duke answered before Eleanor could refuse. "Good." Mrs. Davies looked once at the bruise on Eleanor's wrist and once at the split sole of her boot. The housekeeper's mouth tightened. "I have seen enough boots like that in this house," she said quietly. "Not again." In the east schoolroom chamber, heat met Eleanor like a wall. The grate was built deep and burned clean. Dry linen lay folded on the chair. A basin steamed on the washstand. Dr. Hale, thin and silver-haired, rose from the hearth with his spectacles low on his nose and bowed. "Miss Erikson, sit, if you please." She sat because standing had become uncertain. Dr. Hale touched her forehead, counted her pulse, examined her hands with the care of a conservator handling brittle vellum, and asked plain questions. Had she eaten? Had she slept? How long had the chills lasted? She answered with equal plainness. At the third answer he looked to the Duke. "She has a low fever from exposure and exhaustion. No sign of lung involvement yet. She needs heat, broth, rest, and those cuts cleaned properly. No stair work, no lifting." The Duke said, "You have it." Dr. Hale unrolled a small packet of salve and gauze. "I will leave tincture for the pain and return at dawn." When he had gone, Mrs. Davies knelt without ceremony and peeled away Eleanor's wet stocking from the split boot. The skin beneath was white with cold and rubbed raw at the heel. Mrs. Davies clicked her tongue once, angry in the practical way of women who had carried households through men's errors. "Bootmaker at first light," she said. "I shall send measurements. You will not argue." Eleanor found she had no strength to argue at all. By full dark the rain had stopped, and Mr. Fenwick arrived at Harrow House with 2 clerks, 3 sealed packets, and a magistrate's preliminary order. They assembled in the map room because the library had become a place of witnesses. Lamps were lit along the long table. Thomas sat near the end, wrapped in a wool blanket, awake by stubbornness and worry. He slid from his chair when Eleanor entered and stood straighter when he saw her in dry clothing. Fenwick opened the first packet. Auction evidence. 37 correction slips, inventoried and matched to corresponding volumes. He opened the second. Letters from Mrs. Norwood asserting control and threatening forced matrimonial transfer. He opened the third. House ledgers from Norwood accounts obtained under emergency seal. irregular withdrawals against Miss Erickson's inheritance trust. He looked at Eleanor. "You said there were dawn lesson cards." She crossed to the map cabinet, lifted the loose drawer base and took out the tied stack. Her fingers paused on the top card where Thomas had once pressed too hard and broken a pencil point into the paper. She set the stack before Fenwick. He separated 3 cards, then reached for one of the auction slips. Same hand, same pressure, same compact loops built for narrow margins. He nodded once. "Accounted for." Thomas leaned forward, anxious. "Am I in trouble?" Fenwick's voice softened by a fraction. "No, Master Thomas. You are a witness." The boy absorbed the word as if testing a new tool. "Then I will speak clearly." He did. He repeated what had been said in the corridor. He repeated what Eleanor had taught him. He read one marked line from the charter in a low, steady voice while the clerks wrote. No one in that room laughed. No one looked away. Near midnight, as the last deposition dried under sand, Fenwick set down his pen and addressed Eleanor directly. "Miss Erickson, the emergency petition has been accepted for morning hearing. Mrs. Norwood cannot move funds, papers, or persons attached to your trust pending judgment. Guards remain at her townhouse." Her request to communicate privately with her daughters was denied because they are separately examined. The Duke asked, "And the clerk from Chancery Lane?" "Provided signed statement. He confirms public seizure attempt and your immediate evidence order." Fenwick tied the completed depositions. "All known documents are now either submitted, sealed for court, or retained as personal property by your declared choice." His gaze touched the small private bundle near Eleanor's elbow. "That one remains yours, outside the case file." She placed her hand over it. "Thank you." At 9 the next morning, under a pale sky washed thin after storm, the magistrate heard the matter in a crowded chamber that smelled of damp wool and sealing wax. Lady Norwood stood in peacock silk and spoke with polished injury. Arabella and Cressida sat behind her, faces strained and watchful, their confidence gone brittle. They gave their statements separately when ordered. Arabella admitted she had seen Eleanor write for years. Cressida admitted the letter calling her illiterate had been dictated with intent. Their loaded glances from the auction room paid out as fear under oath. Fenwick presented each piece in sequence. The slips from Harrow volumes, the 2 coercive letters from the attic mattress, the map room lesson cards, the copied ledger pages showing trust income diverted to private gaming debt and jewellery accounts. The magistrate asked Eleanor to read 1 Latin passage, 1 legal clause, and 1 line from her father's earlier correspondence to establish continuity of hand and education. She read all 3 without flourish. Lady Norwood attempted one final turn. "She is an ungrateful dependent with theatrical talents. I fed and housed her," Eleanor answered when asked, voice level. "I was fed when guests could see me and housed where rain entered. The accounts show what was done with my portion, while I was told there was none." The magistrate's ruling came before noon. Mrs. Norwood was stripped of financial authority over Eleanor Erickson's inheritance. Full control reverted to Eleanor immediately as a legal adult beneficiary. Restitution was ordered from Norwood assets under provincial supervision. A temporary travel restriction was imposed. Contact without written consent was prohibited. When Lady Norwood protested rank, the magistrate said rank did not amend arithmetic. She was escorted out under guard, silk rustling, lavender sharp in the air, for one last passing second. She did not look back. Arabella looked once at Eleanor, opened her mouth and closed it. Cressida kept her eyes on the floor. Neither sister ever made the confession she had once promised with a smirk in the corridor, and in the end none was needed. The ledgers had spoken for them. By late afternoon they were back in the library at Harrow, where the storm-dried folios lay in ordered rows, and the damaged 12th century binding had survived because Mrs. Davies had followed Eleanor's sequence exactly. The house had gone unnaturally quiet, as if stone itself were listening. Staff stood at measured distance among the shelves. Steward, footmen, maids, even the junior clerk from the annex. Thomas waited near the atlas stand with ink on his cuff and determination in his chin. The Duke entered, carrying a volume bound in dark blue calf, plain spine, no crest. He stopped before Eleanor and held it out with both hands, as one offered a legal instrument. She took it. The leather was new, still faintly sharp with tannin. She opened to the first page and found her own tiny slips mounted and copied in full script beneath each facsimile, dated, indexed, attributed. At the front was a title page in Fenwick's clerkly hand, Notes on the Harrow Collections, compiled by Miss Eleanor Ingrid Erickson, archivist. Her throat closed for one hard beat. The Duke spoke to the room, each word clear. From this day, Miss Erickson directs the Harrow Archives by my authority and by her own right. She is tutor to Master Thomas in letters and languages. Her instructions stand in library matters without appeal through lower staff. The steward bowed first. Yes, Your Grace. Yes, Miss Erickson. One by one, the others bowed as well. Not deeply, not theatrically, but enough to reverse a year of practiced diminishment in a single, visible line. Thomas stepped forward with a folded paper and held it to Eleanor. I wrote this myself. She unfolded it. The hand was uneven, careful, proud. Miss Erickson taught me to read without shame. She read it twice, then folded it again and placed it inside the new volume. When the staff had withdrawn and only firelight moved across the shelves, the Duke remained where he stood, broad shoulders still, hands empty now. Rainlight from the high windows had turned silver toward dusk. She could hear the old clock in the west hall, counting seconds like measured breath. He said, Stay. She looked up. Not as staff, he continued, as my archivist, as Thomas's tutor, as my wife, if you can bear me. No ornament, no kneeling gesture, no borrowed poetry. Command shaped into an offer and left unshielded in the air between them. Her hands trembled once on the bound volume, then steadied. She thought of the attic draft, the split boot, the hidden slips, the court ledger, the boy by the stove sounding out Carter as if crossing a river stone by stone. She thought of truth named aloud in rooms where lies had ruled by custom. I can bear truth, she said. His breath left him slowly, almost soundless. He inclined his head, not as duke to dependent, but as man to equal witness. Then he reached to the table, took up the old keyring to the West Archive, and placed it in her open palm. The metal settled there with clean, undeniable weight.